I like them feisty.
The air in the private dining room of the Obsidian was thick with the scent of vintage Cabernet and the stifling weight of absolute power. Yi-jun Gok sat at the head of the table, his custom-tailored suit making him look like carved obsidian against the plush velvet chair. Across the table, 3 lieutenants sat in terrified silence, their gazes averted as Yi-jun's cold, calculating eyes remained fixed on the woman standing beside him. Ayanna Ugo felt the familiar burn of indignation rising in her throat. She was a waitress, not a servant, and certainly not a target for the casual, cutting disrespect Yi-jun had been hurling at her all evening. When he reached out to dismissively flick a tip toward her chest, implying her worth could be measured in a few crumpled bills, the dam finally broke. In one fluid, heart-stopping motion, Ayanna leaned across the white linen and tilted the crystal glass in her hand. The deep crimson wine cascaded over Yi-jun's forehead, streaking across his cheek and neck like fresh blood. The room went silent, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical blow. The bodyguards' hands flew to their jackets, eyes wide with shock, ready to end her life for the sacrilege. But as the red liquid dripped onto his crisp white collar, Yi-jun didn't reach for a weapon. He simply wiped a drop of the vintage red from his lip, his jaw clenched tight enough to shatter steel. Slowly, a predatory smile spread across his face, his dark eyes absorbing the light of the room. "I like them feisty," he whispered, his voice wrapped in silk-covered steel. Ayanna didn't wait for the guards to recover or for Yi-jun to change his mind. She turned on her heel and walked out of the private room, the sound of her own heartbeat drumming in her ears like a war march. She ignored the frantic whispers of her manager and the wide-eyed stares of the other staff as she grabbed her coat and burst through the restaurant's heavy oak doors into the damp Seoul night. The cold air hit her like a splash of ice water, grounding her. She had just assaulted the most feared man in the Korean underground, the anchor of the Gok syndicate, whose word could make entire operations crumble. As she hurried toward the subway, she felt the phantom sensation of eyes on her back, the weight of a legacy she hadn't asked to be a part of. By the time she reached her cramped apartment in Itaewon, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a cold, numbing dread. She locked her door with trembling hands and slumped against the wood, sliding down to the floor. The silence of the room was oppressive. Ayanna lived in the shadow of a debt that wasn't hers, a mountain of gambling losses left behind by her brother before he vanished, leaving her to navigate the shark-infested waters of Seoul alone. She had spent 2 years being invisible, a ghost in a blue apron, working 3 jobs just to keep the collectors from breaking her door down. Now she had painted a neon target on her back. She closed her eyes, forcing down a wave of grief and panic. She expected the end to come swiftly, a knock at the door, a black SUV on a dark corner, a sudden silence. She spent the next 3 hours sitting in the dark, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across her ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards made her survival instincts scream. She thought of Yi-jun's face, the blood-red wine staining his skin, the sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, and that terrifying, beautiful smile. He hadn't looked at her like a waitress. He had looked at her like a challenge. When the knock finally came at 3 a.m., it wasn't the frantic pounding of a debt collector or the heavy thud of a hitman. It was 3 rhythmic, measured raps. Ayanna stood, her hands trembling as she gripped a heavy kitchen knife, though she knew it would mean nothing against the men Yi-jun commanded. She peered through the peephole. A man stood in the hall, dressed in a suit that cost more than her yearly salary. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a messenger.
"Miss Ugo,"
the man said through the door, his voice low and respectful. "So, I have something for you." Ayanna cracked the door, the chains still in place. The man handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope. There was no writing on the front, only a wax seal stamped with the image of a heavy anchor.
"Mr. Gok is not a man who enjoys being kept waiting,"
the messenger added with a slight bow. The car will be downstairs at noon." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Ayanna whispered, her voice rough with exhaustion. The man offered a small, knowing smile.
Mr. Gok already paid your brother's debt to the Myung family this evening. He considers it an opening gesture. He believes that in his world, everything comes with a price. He simply wishes to discuss yours."
The messenger turned and walked away before she could respond, leaving Ayanna standing in the doorway with the envelope clutched to her chest. She tore it open with shaking fingers. Inside was not a threat, but an invitation engraved on heavy cardstock, requesting her presence for a private lunch at his estate. There was also a single business card, black with gold lettering. As she looked at the card, Ayanna realized the gravity of her situation. Yi-jun hadn't sent men to kill her because she had become something far more dangerous than an enemy. She had become an interest. She thought of her brother's debt, the weight that had been crushing the life out of her for years, suddenly gone with a single stroke of a pen. It was a gift that felt like a cage. She knew she should run, should take the first flight out of Incheon and never look back. But as she looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror, the brown skin and natural curls that marked her as an outsider in this rigid society, she saw the spark of the woman who had poured that wine. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't a ghost. If Yi-jun Gok wanted a feisty woman, she would show him exactly what that meant. She realized then that 7 days, or even 70, might not be enough to understand the man who had just bought her freedom. She spent the rest of the night not in fear, but in preparation. She washed the scent of the restaurant from her hair and ironed her best dress, the one she had saved for a future she thought would never come. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting long shadows across the Han River, Ayanna sat at her small table and drank a cup of bitter coffee. She didn't know if she was walking into her salvation or her destruction. She only knew that the anchor had dropped, and she was the only thing keeping him from drifting into the dark. She would meet him at noon, not as a waitress, but as a woman who had already looked the monster in the eye and didn't blink. The consequences were about to spiral in ways she never imagined, but as she looked at the invitation one last time, a ghost of a smile touched her own lips. The game had begun. The black sedan arrived at exactly noon, idling like a silent predator at the curb of Ayanna's apartment building. The driver, a man with shoulders as broad as a doorway and an earpiece tucked discreetly into his ear, opened the door without a word. Ayanna stepped inside. The leather seats smelling of expensive sandalwood and something metallic, the unmistakable scent of a world where safety was bought with steel. As the car wound through the glass and steel canyons of Seoul toward the more secluded, affluent suburbs, Ayanna clutched her purse, her mind racing. She was no longer just a waitress. She was an asset in a ledger she hadn't signed. The Gok estate was a fortress of contradictions. Surrounded by high stone walls and iron gates, the main house was a stunning blend of traditional Korean architecture and aggressive modern luxury. Curved tile roofs met floor-to-ceiling glass walls that overlooked manicured gardens where white cranes waded in koi ponds. But the beauty was deceptive. Ayanna counted at least 6 security personnel patrolling the perimeter, their eyes cold and scanning for threats. This wasn't just a home, it was a command center. She was led through a grand foyer where marble floors were inlaid with intricate patterns and ancient scrolls hung beside contemporary oil paintings. The house felt cold, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. It was the silence of a man who lived alone in a crowd. Finally, the house manager, a woman whose expression was as severe as her traditional hanbok, stopped before a pair of heavy mahogany doors. "Mr. Gok is expecting you in the study," the woman said, her voice devoid of warmth. "And Miss Ugo? Do not make the mistake of thinking your feistiness is a permanent shield. In this house, everything has a shelf life." Ayanna took a breath, squared her shoulders, and pushed the doors open. The study was vast, filled with the scent of old paper and expensive whiskey. Yi-jun Gok sat behind a massive desk of dark teak, his silhouette framed by the sprawling gardens outside. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and covered in a tapestry of ink. An anchor was etched into the side of his neck, a symbol of the weight he carried and the ground he refused to give. On the desk sat a single crystal glass of red wine, a silent nod to their first encounter. "You're late," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel wrapped in velvet. "The traffic in Seoul doesn't care about mafia schedules," Ayanna countered, walking toward the center of the room. She refused to be cowed by the opulence or the man. "You bought my brother's debt. Why?" Yi-jun stood, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. Said he was taller than he'd seemed at the restaurant, his presence overwhelming.
"I don't like messy ledgers, Ayanna. Your brother owed money to people who don't understand the value of a slow burn. They would have broken you to get to him. And I decided," he paused, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw, "that I'd rather have you whole."
"I'm not for sale," she snapped.
"You weren't for sale,"
he corrected, pulling a thick folder from the desk and tossing it toward her.
"But you were in debt. Now you owe me. 700 million won. A life's work for a waitress, wouldn't you say?"
Ayanna felt the air leave her lungs as she looked at the figure on the top page. It was more than she'd even imagined. "What do you want from me?"
"I have enough killers and thieves," Yi-jun said, leaning against the desk.
What I don't have is someone who isn't afraid to look me in the eye when I'm being a monster.
You will stay here. You will be my personal assistant, my private server, the one person in this house who doesn't bow when I enter the room. You will work off the debt, one day at a time."
"And if I refuse?" Yi-jun's smile didn't reach his eyes.
"Then you go back to the street, and I let the Myung family know I've lost interest in your protection. How long do you think you'll last?"
The trap was elegant and absolute. He hadn't just bought her debt. He had bought her time, her presence, and her defiance. He wanted to own the very thing that had insulted him. Ayanna looked at the folder, then back at the man who wore authority like a second skin. She saw the loneliness in the corners of his gaze, at the exhaustion of a man who had forgotten how to trust. "One condition," Ayanna said, her voice steady. "I'm not a pet. I'm an employee. We have a contract, signed, witnessed, and legally binding." Yi-jun let out a short, sharp laugh, the first genuine sound she'd heard from him.
"Always fighting. Fine. My lawyer will have it ready within the hour. But understand this, Ayanna. In this world, a contract is only as strong as the man who signs it, and I am the only thing standing between you and the dark."
He reached out, his thumb grazing her cheek with a surprising gentleness that made her breath catch.
"Welcome to the Gok family. Try not to pour anything on me today."
As she was shown to her quarters, a suite that was more luxurious than her entire apartment building, Ayanna looked at the gold-leafed mirror. She was in a gilded cage, bound to a man who was as dangerous as he was devastating. She had traded a life of grinding poverty for a life of high-stakes peril. As she watched the armed guards patrol the gardens below, she realized that the gilded debt was more than just money. It was the beginning of a bond that would either anchor her to a new life or drag them both to the bottom of the sea. The transition from the chaotic, grease-stained reality of the restaurant to the sterile, terrifying elegance of the Gok estate felt like a fever dream Ayanna couldn't wake from. Her first morning on duty began before the sun had fully crested the horizon, the house manager, Min So, appearing at her door with a crisp black uniform that felt more like a costume than clothing. And she was tasked with a singular duty, to be the only person allowed within Yi-jun's personal study during his morning briefings. It was a position of immense trust and even greater peril, placing her directly in the line of sight of a man who looked at the world like a game of chess he had already won. She entered the study carrying a tray of traditional Korean tea, the steam rising in delicate ribbons against the cool morning air. Yi-jun was standing by the window, his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the rising light. He was shirtless, his skin a canvas of dark, intricate ink that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Ayanna froze, the tray heavy in her hands as she tracked the path of the tattoos. Dragons and phoenixes, symbols of power and rebirth, coiled around his ribs and climbed his spine. But it was the mark on the side of his neck that drew her eye. A small, starkly black anchor that looked more like a brand than a piece of art. "You're staring, Ayanna," Yi-jun said without turning, his voice vibrating through the quiet room. "It's hard not to," she replied, regaining her composure and setting the tray on the low table. "I've seen a lot of ink in Itaewon, but nothing like this. It looks heavy." Yi-jun turned then, his eyes dark and unreadable. He walked toward her, the muscles in his chest and arms corded with a strength that made her survival instincts prickle. He sat in the leather chair, gesturing for her to pour the tea. As she leaned in, the proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the sandalwood and the faint, sharp scent of expensive tobacco. From this distance, the anchor tattoo was vivid, the lines clean and deliberate. "In my world, an anchor isn't about stability," he said, touching the mark on his neck with a calloused finger. "It's about being moored to a bottom you didn't choose. Every man in my family since my grandfather has worn this mark. It's the Gok legacy, the weight of a lineage that demands everything and gives nothing back." Ayanna paused, the teapot hovering over the porcelain cup. "You make it sound like a sentence." "It is a sentence," he replied, his jaw tightening in a way that reminded her of the steel-clad resolve she'd seen on the train when he faced his enemies. 12 generations of Gok men have held the anchor title. We control the shipping, the imports, the very pulse of the underground from here to the West Coast. But the price is that we can never leave the water. We are tied to the darkness of the depths, ensuring the family survives while we slowly drown." He looked at her then, an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. "You, however, are a flame. You don't belong in the water, Ayanna. That's why you poured that wine. You weren't just angry, you were trying to burn through the glass." Ayanna felt a strange, uncomfortable heat rise in her chest. No one had ever spoken to her like that, seeing the desperation behind her defiance. "I poured that wine because you were being a jerk," she said, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "Legacy or not, it doesn't give you the right to treat people like they're disposable." Yi-jun's expression softened fractionally, a ghost of the smile she'd seen when he'd first called her Feisty flickering on his lips. "Perhaps, but in this house, tradition is the only thing that keeps the wolves at bay. The other families, the Parks, the Hans, they watch for any sign that the anchor is slipping. If I show mercy, if I deviate from the path my father set, they move in. What you did at the restaurant, it was a scandal. A black woman, an outsider, shaming a Gok boss in front of his men." "Is that why you brought me here?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "To punish me? Or to hide me?" "I brought you here because you're the first thing in 30 years that hasn't felt like a script," Yi-jun admitted, standing and moving so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He reached out, his hand hovering near her natural curls but not quite touching them. "The Gok legacy is a cage, Ayanna. But for the first time, I think I want to see what happens if I let the fire inside." The air between them was electric, a dangerous blend of attraction and the looming threat of the world outside. Ayanna knew that by staying, she was becoming part of a tradition she didn't understand, a sacred bond that in the old ways made her both valuable and vulnerable to his enemies. She was the pollution the traditionalists feared, the variable that could make the anchor finally break free or drag them both to the bottom. As Yi-jun finally reached out and tucked a stray coil of hair behind her ear,
His touch was surprisingly reverent. "Stay for the week, Ayanna. Learn the weight of the ink. And then, if you still want to burn the house down, I'll give you the match." She watched him walk away to answer a ringing phone, his back once again a map of history and violence. She looked down at her hands, which were no longer shaking. She had come to the estate expecting a prison, but as she watched the man with the anchor on his neck, she realized she might have found the only person in the world who felt as trapped as she did. The weight of the Gok legacy was heavy, but as she picked up the tray, Ayanna knew she wasn't ready to let go of the line just yet. The preparation for the summit was a battlefield of silken fabrics and stifling expectations. Minso, the house manager whose severity seemed etched into her very bones, oversaw Ayanna's transformation with a silent, simmering disapproval. She dressed Ayanna not in the blue apron of a waitress, but in a gown of midnight silk that draped over her curves like shadows. Its high collar a subtle nod to traditional Korean aesthetics, while the bold cut of the back celebrated Ayanna's own strength. "You are walking into a den of wolves, Miss Ugo," Minso whispered as she adjusted a silver pin in Ayanna's hair, her expression softening only fractionally with a warning. "To the elders, you are not a guest. You are a statement of war against tradition, an outsider threatening the very idea of bloodline purity." Yi-jun was waiting at the base of the grand staircase, looking devastating in a charcoal suit that made him look like carved obsidian. The anchor tattoo on his neck was partially obscured by his crisp white collar, yet its presence felt heavier than ever, a mark of power that usually meant men bowed when he entered the room. When he saw her, his normally cold, calculating eyes held a flicker of something foreign, unfiltered admiration that bordered on relief. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply reached out and took her hand, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with a surprising gentleness. "Tonight, you do not pour the wine," he said, his voice wrapped in silk-covered steel. "Tonight, you drink it." The summit was held at a private, centuries-old estate in the mountains outside Seoul, a place where manicured gardens met traditional curved tile roofs in a stunning blend of luxury and fortress-like security. As they stepped out of the black sedan, the atmosphere was immediately charged. Armed men stood with military precision at every entrance, their hands resting casually near their jackets in a way that suggested hidden weapons, their eyes sweeping the property for any sign of dissent. When Yi-jun walked into the main hall with Ayanna on his arm, the room went silent. Not the respectful silence usually afforded to the anchor of the Gok family, but a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. The elders of the major families, the Parks and the Hans, sat around a low traditional table, their expressions carved from stone as they watched the pair approach. Elder Han, a man whose skin looked like weathered parchment and whose eyes seemed to absorb the light, was the first to speak. He didn't look at Ayanna. He looked at Yi-jun as if she were a ghost or a stain. "Yi-jun Gok," he began, his voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of ancient families. "We were told you were bringing a guest. We did not realize you were bringing a distraction from the bloodline. Oh, an outsider who does not belong in this household." "Ayanna Ugo is not a distraction," Yi-jun replied, his tone ice-cold as he led her to the seat directly beside him, a position usually reserved for a wife or a high-ranking lieutenant. He ignored the collective intake of breath from the bodyguards standing with military precision behind their bosses. "She is my guest, and in my world, my word is the only tradition that matters." Ayanna felt the weight of their stares, some curious, some openly disapproving as they took in her appearance. She remembered the way the passengers on the train had averted their eyes from a man like Yi-jun. But here, the elders stared with the intent to dissect. Across the table, a younger man from the Park Syndicate sneered, and his gaze sweeping over Ayanna's dark skin and natural curls with a disgust that made her blood boil. "Tradition demands purity and honor, Yi-jun," the younger Park said, his voice dripping with condescension. A woman who shamed a boss by pouring wine on his face belongs in the kitchen, not at a table where the fate of the West Coast is decided. Ayanna didn't wait for Yi-jun to defend her. She leaned forward, the silver of her jewelry catching the warm light of the room, her facial expression intense and angry. "In my world," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her, "honor isn't something you inherit through a bloodline or hide behind a suit. It's something you earn by having the courage to stand your ground when everyone else is waiting for you to break." The shock in the room intensified. To the elders, at her voice was a pollution of the sacred space, a breach of the old ways. But Yi-jun didn't order her away. He simply tilted his head, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he watched his lieutenants and rivals shift uncomfortably. "I told you," he whispered to the table, though his eyes never left Ayanna. "I like them feisty." The dinner that followed was a minefield of coded insults and traditional posturing. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word a potential trigger for a war that could level every property they owned. Elder Han spoke of sacred bonds and the old laws, his words a thinly veiled warning that Yi-jun's obsession with Ayanna made him vulnerable. "You have made her valuable, and you have made her a target, Yi-jun," the elder noted, his eyes finally flickering to Ayanna with a glint of predatory interest. "In our world, intentions do not matter. Actions do. And by bringing her here, you have invited the storm." As the night wore on, Ayanna realized the truth of the elder's words. She wasn't just a +1, she was a litmus test for Yi-jun's power. If he could protect her in this den of wolves, he was invincible. If he failed, his entire empire, the shipping, the construction, the very legacy of the anchor, would be seen as crumbling. The tension peaked when a server approached to pour the wine, and the younger Park reached out to grab Ayanna's wrist, his fingers tightening painfully. "Tell me, waitress," he sneered, his breath hot and foul. "Does the anchor know he's dragging his family to the bottom just to keep you afloat?" Yi-jun's hand was on the table, his jaw clenched so tight it could shatter steel. The air itself seemed to bend around him, a wave of lethal danger rolling off him that made survival instincts scream. "Let her go," he said, his voice dropping to a rough, gravelly whisper that promised death. "Or I will show you exactly what happens when someone touches what belongs to the Gok family." The threat was absolute. The younger man released her, his eyes darting to the guards who had moved closer, their hands visible and ready. The scandal was no longer a whisper. It was a loud, bloody declaration that the old ways were being challenged. As they finally left the estate, the darkness of the mountain air felt heavy with the promise of a conflict that would spiral in ways neither of them could imagine. Ayanna looked at Yi-jun in the back of the car, his face carved from stone but his hand firmly finding hers. She had walked into the den and survived, but as the gates of the estate clicked shut behind them, she knew the hunt had only just begun. The return to the Gok estate was marked by a silence that was both a relief and a torment. The adrenaline of the summit had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache that Ayanna recognized as a different kind of hunger, one that food could not satisfy. As she changed out of the midnight silk gown, her hands were still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the raw impact of Yi-jun's fierce protectiveness. She dressed in a simple, high-collared tunic and made her way to the private dining room, expecting to find the usual cold efficiency of the house staff. Instead, she found the room bathed in soft, amber light, the long teak table set for only two. Yi-jun was already there, but he had shed the charcoal suit and the heavy armor of the anchor. He was dressed in a simple black sweater, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the stories in ink that marked him as someone dangerous, yet profoundly lonely. He didn't look like a boss as he poured 2 glasses of wine. He looked like a man whose normally cold, calculating eyes held a flicker of something foreign, exhaustion. He gestured to the chair across from him, his jaw no longer clenched so tight it could shatter steel. "Sit, Ayanna," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Tonight, there are no elders, no debts, and no waitresses. There is only the truth."
Ayanna sat, her survival instincts whispering for her to remain guarded, but the vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. For the first 30 minutes, they ate in a silence that had replaced the chaos of the summit. It wasn't until the wine was half gone that the walls began to crumble. Ayanna looked at the anchor tattoo on his neck, the mark of a legacy that seemed to constrict around him like a cage. "You said earlier that your family has worn that mark for 12 generations," she began softly, her eyes locked on his. "But what about the man behind the ink? Who was Yi-jun before he became the anchor?" Yi-jun's fingers traced the rim of his glass, his expression tightening with a flash of such raw pain that Ayanna caught her breath.
"The man you see was forged in the fire of expectation," he admitted, his accent thickening with emotion.
"My mother died giving birth to me, leaving me with a father who saw me not as a son, but as a successor. He taught me that in our world, kindness is a blade, and everything has a price. I was 10 years old the first time I saw a man die, and my father told me to watch the light leave his eyes, so I would never be afraid of the dark." He looked up, his eyes dark and intense, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it.
"I spent 30 years building walls, Ayanna. I married a woman from a pure bloodline because it was expected, only to watch her bleed out during childbirth 3 months before I met you. I held her hand and felt the light leave her, knowing I was losing my wife and my son was losing his mother before he'd even taken his first breath. I thought my heart had simply stopped beating that night. I was an emperor on a throne of glass, Waiting for someone to finally shatter it."
Ayanna felt tears prick her own eyes as she listened to the haunting melody of his grief. She thought of her own brother, Franklin, whose gambling had been a desperate attempt to win back a life they had lost when their parents died. "I know that sound," she whispered, her grief recognizing his even as her own walls began to fall. "I lost everything too. When my parents died, I became the anchor for my brother. I worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and ignored the gaping wound in my heart just to keep him afloat. But Franklin, he was looking for something primal, something I couldn't provide. He vanished 8 months ago, leaving me with a debt that felt like a funeral pyre." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his, and the contact sent electricity up her arm. "Oh, I thought I was a ghost, Yi-jun. I thought the only thing left of me was the anger I poured into that wine glass. But when you looked at me on that train, no, at the restaurant, I felt like I was coming home." Yi-jun's hand turned over, catching hers, his thumb stroking her skin with surprising gentleness.
"In my world, there are no gifts," he said, his voice dangerous yet testing. "But what you did, looking at me with such fierce defiance, refusing to be stripped of your flesh or bone by my gaze, that was a gift I didn't know I needed. You are the only person who has ever offered me something without wanting a price in return."
They sat in the quiet of the estate, 2 broken people becoming whole in the amber light. The air was no longer heavy with danger, as it was full of a different kind of hunger, a hunger for a future forged not by blood or tradition, but by choice. Ayanna looked at the dangerous, beautiful man before her and saw the vulnerability that he had hidden behind his armor. "I'm scared, Yi-jun," she whispered, her cheeks flushing as she admitted the truth. "I'm scared of what this world will do to us."
"So am I,"
he replied, leaning closer until his forehead pressed against hers. "But I'm more scared of letting you walk away. These past few days, I've watched you be so brave. Brave enough to walk into a world you didn't understand and brave enough to love a monster. Give me time, Ayanna. Give me time to prove that I can be the man you deserve." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a soft press of lips that asked permission rather than demanding surrender. Ayanna froze for half a heartbeat before she melted into it, feeling months of walls crumbling around her heart. He tasted like whiskey and danger, but his hands cradled her face like she was sacred. In that moment, the anchor wasn't a weight dragging them down. It was the only thing keeping them grounded in a storm that was just beginning to brew. The relative peace that had settled over the Gok estate after their private dinner was a fragile glass ornament, beautiful but destined to shatter. It lasted only 3 days before the shadow of the summit caught up to them. Yi-jun had been forced to leave for the Incheon docks to handle a distraction regarding a delayed shipment. A tactic Ayanna now realized was a calculated move to draw the anchor away from his harbor. Left under the watchful eyes of Minso and a rotating shift of bodyguards, Ayanna spent her morning in the library, trying to lose herself in the history of the city that seemed determined to swallow her whole. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't an explosion or a shout, but a gift delivered to the front gate. Minso entered the library with a face carved from pale stone, carrying a traditional wooden box tied with a silk ribbon of funerary white. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single broken porcelain teacup, the exact pattern from the summit table, stained with dried red wine. Beside it lay a note in elegant, archaic Korean script that Minso refused to translate until Ayanna demanded it with the fierce authority Yi-jun had begun to cultivate in her. "It says," Minso began, at her voice trembling with a rare flicker of fear, "that a stained vessel cannot hold the legacy of the Gok family. It says the anchor is being dragged down by a weight that does not belong in these waters." Before Ayanna could process the veiled threat, the estate's secondary perimeter alarm hummed, a low, vibrating warning that someone was approaching the guest quarters. Ayanna stood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She didn't wait for the guards. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the rear gardens. Standing near the koi pond, looking entirely out of place in his traditional silk robes amidst the modern security cameras, was Elder Han's primary enforcer, a man whose presence made the air itself seem to grow cold. Ayanna walked out onto the terrace, ignoring Minso's frantic protests. She was done hiding in gilded cages. As she approached the man, she saw the blatant, cold disapproval in his eyes, the same gaze she had faced on the train and at the summit, a look that stripped her of her humanity and reduced her to a pollution of their sacred traditions. "Elder Han sends his regards," the enforcer said, his English perfect and devoid of emotion. "He wishes you to understand that Briar Yi-jun is a man of great potential, but he has forgotten what it means to be Korean. He has forgotten honor and bloodline purity because of the feisty distraction you provide." "If Elder Han has something to say, he can say it to Yi-jun," Ayanna countered, her jaw clenching with the intensity of her anger. "I'm not a message board for old men who are afraid of change." The enforcer moved with impossible speed, stepping into her personal space. The bodyguards nearby shifted, their hands going to their jackets, but they hesitated. Killing an enforcer of the Han family on neutral ground was an invitation to an all-out war. "You do not understand the stakes, Waitress," the man hissed, his breath smelling of bitter tea. 3 families have already made inquiries about your status. They want to know if Yi-jun has claimed you formally, or if you are just a temporary lapse in judgment. To some, you are a valuable weakness. To others, you are a stain that must be bleached from the record. He reached out, not to strike her, but to hold up a digital tablet. The screen showed a live feed of a small, nondescript apartment in Itaewon, Ayanna's apartment. A group of men were inside, systematically tearing her life apart, searching for something that wasn't there. "We know about your brother, Franklin. We know about the debt Yi-jun bought. But in our world, debts are never truly paid. They are simply traded. If you do not leave Seoul by midnight, the next thing we tear apart won't be a room. It will be the anchor himself." Ayanna felt the room spin. The threat was no longer a shadow. It was a blade at Yi-jun's throat. They were using her to dismantle him, turning her presence, the one thing that made him feel alive, into the very thing that would destroy him. "He would burn this city to the ground before he let you touch me," she whispered, echoing the fierce promise Yi-jun had made to her in the quiet hours of the night.
"And that is exactly what we want,"
the enforcer smiled, a vicious, thin-lipped expression. A boss who burns his own city for a woman is a boss who is no longer fit to lead. Choose, Ayanna Ugo. Be his salvation by leaving, or be his destruction by staying. The enforcer vanished back into the trees before the guards could intervene, leaving Ayanna standing alone in the manicured silence of the garden. When Yi-jun returned an hour later, he looked like death incarnate. His suit was torn, and a streak of blood marked his forehead from a skirmish at the docks that had been a blatant distraction. He found Ayanna in the study, holding the broken teacup. The moment their eyes met, the mask of the cold boss shattered. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with a barely controlled intensity. "What happened? Minso said someone was here." "Elder Han made his move," Ayanna said, at her voice trembling as she told him of the enforcer and the threat to his leadership. "Yi-jun, they're calling me a stain. They're saying that by keeping me here, you're breaking the old laws. They want me gone, or they'll take everything from you." Yi-jun's eyes went black and cold, radiating a lethal intent that made the air itself seem to bend around him. He pulled her close, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to her forehead.
"Listen to me very carefully," he growled, his voice a rough prayer and a curse. "You are under my protection. That means I would sacrifice every warehouse, every ship, and everyone in the Gok treasury before I let them dictate who I love. They think you are my weakness, Ayanna, but they are wrong."
He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are the only thing that makes the anchor worth carrying. Oh, we have 3 days left on our contract, but I am telling you now, I am not done convincing you to stay. Let the storm come. I've spent my whole life in the dark. I'm not afraid of a little thunder." But as Ayanna held on to him, she looked at the anchor on his neck and felt a new, terrifying weight. She loved him, and in the world of the Korean American underground, that love was the most dangerous weapon their enemies possessed. The shadow of Elder Han had fallen over the estate, and she knew that the next move wouldn't be a gift. It would be a funeral. The quiet of the following evening was an artificial construct, a thin veil of civility draped over a house that was now a fortress under siege. They were seated in the smaller private dining room, a space of warm lighting and wooden wall panels that usually offered a reprieve from the cold grandeur of the main hall. The table was set with pristine white tablecloths and crystal wine glasses, a stark contrast to the violence lurking just beyond the estate's iron gates. Yi-jun sat across from Ayanna, the sharp lines of his face softened by the candlelight, though his jaw remained clenched so tight it could have shattered steel. He was watching her with an intensity that made the air feel heavy, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass, as if he were trying to anchor himself to the present moment. The disruption didn't come with the roar of engines or the shattering of glass. It came in the form of a trusted server, a man who had worked for the Gok family for a decade, entering the room with a fresh bottle of wine. Ayanna, whose survival instincts had been honed in the harshest corners of the city, noticed the tremor in the man's hand before she saw the glint of the blade hidden beneath the white linen napkin. Her response was instinctual, a flash of the flame that Yi-jun had so quickly come to admire. Before the assassin could bridge the distance, Ayanna surged to her feet. She leaned aggressively toward Yi-jun, not to hide, but to act as a shield and a weapon simultaneously. Her facial expression was intense and angry, her mouth open as she shouted a warning that shattered the room's artificial peace. In one fluid motion, she grabbed a heavy crystal wine glass. She didn't throw it. She swung it with a precision born of years of handling unruly patrons in underground bars. The glass shattered against the assassin's wrist, the red wine spraying across the white tablecloth like a premature burst of blood. The room erupted into cinematic chaos. In the background, the 3 guards stationed by the door stood in a state of absolute shock, their mouths open and eyes widened as they watched the scene unfold. They had been trained to protect the boss from rival syndicates and external hits, but they had never expected the feisty waitress to be the one to intercept an internal betrayal. Yi-jun moved like carved obsidian, his hand going to his hip even as the assassin, reeling from Ayanna's assault, managed a desperate, glancing blow. A small blade sliced across Yi-jun's forehead, and suddenly, the pristine image of the mafia boss was gone. Visible blood began running down the right side of his face from his forehead, streaking across his cheek and neck, and staining his crisp white collar. His eyes were partially closed for a heartbeat as the pain flared, but he didn't falter. He stood, danger rolling off him in waves that made the air itself seem to bend. Ayanna didn't step back. She remained in her aggressive stance, pointing the jagged stem of the broken wine glass toward the man who had dared to touch Yi-jun. She was a woman who had survived being invisible, but in this moment, she was the most visible thing in the room, a protector in a blue apron and silk. The guards finally found their movement, tackling the traitorous server to the marble floor. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Yi-jun's heavy, rhythmic breathing. He stood by the table, the blood on his face a vivid testament to the high-stakes game they were playing. He looked down at the white linen, now ruined by wine and blood, then turned his gaze toward Ayanna. The shock in his dark eyes had transformed into something profound, a realization that she wasn't just a distraction or a weakness he had to protect. She was his equal in the storm. He reached up, wiping a streak of blood from his cheek with a steady hand, a slow, devastating smile touching his lips despite the pain. "I told them," he whispered, his voice rough with a mixture of gravel and velvet. "I told them you were sacred. I told them I liked you feisty." Ayanna felt the adrenaline begin to ebb, replaced by a fierce, protective heat. She dropped the broken glass onto the ruined tablecloth and walked around the table to him. She didn't wait for permission. She took a clean napkin and pressed it against the cut on his forehead, so her hands steady despite the chaos. "In my world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we don't wait for someone else to save us. We do it ourselves." Yi-jun's hand covered hers, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with a gentleness that contradicted the lethal intent still radiating from his posture. The anchor tattoo on his neck pulsed with his heartbeat, a reminder of the legacy he was now willing to burn to the ground for her. The blood on the linen wasn't a sign of his defeat. It was the mark of her entry into his world as a partner, not a pawn. "They thought you were my weakness," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers, even as his men began dragging the traitor away. "But they just realized you're the only weapon I have that they can't predict." The moment was intimate and terrifying, in a quiet sanctuary built in the aftermath of violence. As Ayanna looked at the blood staining his suit and the broken glass scattered around them, she realized that the gilded debt was no longer about money or a brother's mistakes. It was about this, standing in the beak with a man who would burn a city for her, and realizing she was more than ready to hold the match. The assassination attempt had failed to take Yi-jun's life, but it had successfully murdered any remaining doubt in Ayanna's heart. She was no longer just staying for a week, she was staying for the war. And as the backup security flooded the room, Ayanna Ugo stood her ground beside the anchor, the flame of her defiance burning brighter than the emergency lights. The blood on the white linen had barely dried before the summons arrived, delivered not by a messenger, but by the heavy, rhythmic tolling of the estate's traditional bronze bell. It was the sound of the Council of Elders, the true architects of the underground, demanding an accounting for the pollution that had led to an assassination attempt within the sacred walls of the Gok household. Yi-jun did not wash the streak of dried blood from his forehead. He wore it like a badge of the war that had already begun. He dressed in a fresh suit of charcoal gray, but his movements were no longer those of a man performing a script. He was a man prepared to tear the script to pieces. He led Ayanna into the grand hall, a room where the air itself seemed to hold the weight of a 12-generation legacy. The elders sat in a semicircle, their traditional robes a sea of somber silks that contrasted sharply with the high-tech security monitors flickering in the corners. Elder Han sat at the center, his eyes like ancient coals. He looked at Ayanna with a disgust so profound it felt like a physical weight, his gaze sweeping over her dark skin and the defiant set of her shoulders. To him, she was not a woman who had saved a boss's life. She was a variable that had broken the sacred mathematics of their world.
Yi-jun Gok, Elder Han began, his voice a dry rasp that echoed off the marble floors. The anchor is meant to hold the family steady. Instead, your hand has wavered. You have brought a woman into this house who is not of our blood, not of our tradition, and not of our laws. Because of her, a server of 10 years turned his blade on his master. Because of her. No, the Park family laughs at the Gok name.
Yi-jun stood at the center of the hall, his hand firmly gripping Ayanna's, his presence overwhelming the room with a lethal intent that made the younger bodyguards shift uncomfortably. A server turned his blade because he was bought by cowards who are afraid of change, Yi-jun countered, his voice wrapped in silk-covered steel. Ayanna Ugo did not bring the storm. She was the only one with the courage to stand in it while you all hid behind your ancient scrolls.
Courage is irrelevant when it threatens the foundation, a second elder spoke, his tone dripping with condescension. In the old traditions, a woman who nurses a boss's wounds or saves his life can be seen as sacred, but she can also be seen as a poison. You have allowed an outsider to witness the inner workings of our empire. You have made her valuable, and in doing so, you have made the Gok family vulnerable. The ultimatum was delivered with the cold efficiency of a death sentence. Elder Han leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. The council has voted. You are given a choice, Yi-jun. You may remain the anchor, the most powerful man on the West Coast, with all the resources and protection of the Gok name. But to do so, you must dispose of the distraction. The woman must be returned to the streets, her memory of this house erased, or, he paused, his eyes glinting with a vicious certainty. You may choose the outsider, but if you do, you walk away with nothing. No empire, no protection, and no legacy. You will be a man alone, hunted by every family that once bowed to you. The silence that followed was deafening. Ayanna felt the air leave her lungs, her fingers tightening around Yi-jun's hand. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had spent his entire life being forged into a monster of efficiency and power. She thought of the anchor on his neck, the mark of a cage he had never been allowed to leave. She was prepared for him to let go. She was prepared to be the sacrifice that kept his world intact because she loved him enough to want him to survive, even if it was in the dark. But Yi-jun didn't let go. He stepped forward, pulling Ayanna with him until they stood at the very edge of the elder's platform. He reached up and unbuttoned his collar, revealing the anchor tattoo in its entirety, the ink dark and defiant against his skin. You call her a distraction, Yi-jun said, his voice dropping to
a gravelly whisper that carried to every corner of the hall. But she is the only thing in this life that has ever made me feel like more than a ghost. You offer me an empire of shadows and a legacy of blood, but what good is a throne if the man sitting on it has no soul? He looked at Ayanna, and for a heartbeat, the cold boss was gone. In his eyes was the vulnerability that had taken her breath away in the nursery, the raw, unfiltered truth of a man who had finally found his home. I have spent 30 years being the anchor for a family that would see me drown for the sake of tradition, he said, turning back to the elders. I am done. If the price of loving her is my empire, then take it. Burn the warehouses,
strip the name. I would give it all up 1,000 times over to keep her safe. The shock that rippled through the hall was like a physical blow. To the elders, this wasn't just a choice. It was a sacrilege. It was a boss willing to trade a decade of being untouchable for the life of a black woman who had been a waitress only a week before. "You are a fool, Yi-jun," Elder Han hissed, his composure finally cracking. "You think love will protect you from the wolves? Without the Gok name, you are nothing but a target." "I may be a target," Yi-jun replied, a dangerous smile curving his lips, the smile of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. "But I will be a man who is truly free. And as for the wolves, let them come. They'll find that a man with nothing left to lose is the most terrifying thing in this city." He turned on his heel, leading Ayanna out of the grand hall without looking back. Yet the bodyguards stood frozen, caught between their training and the sheer magnitude of the boss's defection. As they emerged into the cool night air, the weight of the decision settled over them like a blanket. They were no longer the rulers of the estate. They were fugitives in a world that ran deeper than blood. "You gave it all up," Ayanna whispered as they reached the car, her voice thick with tears. "Yi-jun, why?" He stopped, framing her face with his hands, his thumbs stroking her skin with a reverence that made her head spin. "Because the Empire was my cage, Ayanna, and you are my salvation. I didn't just choose you over the Gok name. I chose life over the dark." He kissed her then, a deep, desperate promise that they were in this together regardless of the consequences. The choice of the anchor had been made. But he had cut the line, and as they drove away from the estate, leaving the legacy of 12 generations behind them, Ayanna realized they weren't just running toward safety. They were running toward each other, into a storm that they would finally face as equals. The city of Seoul had transformed from a neon playground into a sprawling graveyard of loyalty. As the black SUV sped toward the towering glass monolith of the Gok headquarters, Ayanna could feel the vibrations of a world ending. Yi-jun sat beside her, his custom-tailored charcoal suit now stained with the dust and grime of their flight, his jaw clenched so tight it could shatter steel. He was no longer the untouchable emperor. He was a man who had burned his own throne to save the only thing that made his heart beat. The anchor tattoo on his neck pulsed with every rhythmic, yet heavy breath, a mark of the weight he was finally ready to drop. The headquarters was surrounded. Black vehicles blocked the entrances, and men in dark suits, the soldiers of the park and Han syndicates, stood with military precision, their hands resting near their jackets in a way that suggested hidden weapons. This was the siege Yi-jun had predicted, the moment the wolves moved in to scavenge the remains of an empire. But as the SUV screeched to a halt, Yi-jun didn't look at the army outside. He looked at Ayanna. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, his voice low and rough like gravel wrapped in velvet. "You could run. I'll give you the opening." Ayanna didn't blink. She reached into the footwell and pulled out a heavy, steel-plated tray she had scavenged, a tool of her trade turned into a weapon of war. Her facial expression was intense and angry, her mouth set in a firm line of defiance. "I'm not a distraction, Yi-jun," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not a waitress anymore. I'm the woman who poured wine on your face, remember? I don't run." A dangerous smile curved Yi-jun's lips, transforming his face from a mask of stone to a portrait of devastating handsomeness. "I like them feisty," he echoed, the words now a battle cry rather than a dismissal. They burst from the car together. The air was immediately filled with the sharp crack of gunfire and the scent of cordite. Yi-jun moved like death incarnate, his hand going to his hip and coming up with a weapon he used with lethal, practiced efficiency. He cleared the path to the lobby, his movements synchronized with Ayanna's as if they had been fighting side by side for years. When a guard lunged for her, Ayanna didn't scream. She swung the heavy tray with the same fluid grace she had once used to serve cocktails,
the edge connecting with the man's jaw with a crack that echoed through the marble hall. Inside the lobby, the carnage was cinematic. Mirrors shattered, and the warm lighting flickered as bullets tore through wooden wall panels and neatly arranged displays. They were forced into a corner near the executive elevators. A glancing bullet grazed Yi-jun's forehead, and once again, visible blood began running down the right side of his face, streaking across his cheek and neck. He sat rigidly against a marble pillar for a heartbeat, his eyes partially closed as he fought the pain, but his grip on his weapon never wavered. "Yi-jun!" Ayanna screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. As she grabbed a white silk scarf from a display case and pressed it to his head, her hands steady despite the chaos. "I'm fine," he growled, forcing his eyes open. He looked at her, his dark eyes absorbing the light, and for a second, the mafia boss was gone. There was only raw, unfiltered panic, not for himself, but for her. "They're coming for you, Ayanna. Park Jin-ho is in the penthouse. He wants the feisty woman to watch me fall." "Then let's go show him he's wrong," Ayanna said, pulling him to his feet. They fought their way up, floor by floor, through a fortress that was being dismantled by greed. In the executive kitchen, Ayanna used her knowledge of the environment to their advantage. As the Park family soldiers closed in, she shattered bottles of high-proof alcohol across the floor and ignited them with a lighter, creating a wall of flame that forced the enemies back. Yi-jun watched her, his expression one of pure wonder. She was the pollution the elders feared, the unpredictable fire that didn't follow the old laws. When they finally burst into the penthouse, Park Jin-ho was waiting. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the burning city he hoped to inherit. He turned, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he saw Yi-jun's blood-stained suit and Ayanna's defiant stance. "The anchor and his waitress," Park sneered, his breath smelling of bitter tradition. "Do you know what the families think of this, Yi-jun? They think you've forgotten what it means to be Korean. They think you've sacrificed an empire for a stain." "I didn't sacrifice anything," Yi-jun said, his voice dropping to that rough, dangerous whisper. "Oh, I traded a cage for a home. And as for being a stain..." He looked at Ayanna, his thumb grazing the back of her hand. "She's the only thing in this city that's actually clean." The final struggle was brief but brutal. Park lunged for Ayanna, but she didn't wait to be saved. She slammed her shoulder into his chest, throwing him off balance, giving Yi-jun the opening he needed. Within minutes, the man who had tried to dismantle their lives was on his knees, defeated. Yi-jun stood over him, his gun leveled at Park's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. The monster everyone feared was there, his eyes black and cold, radiating lethal intent. "Don't!" Ayanna's voice cut through the haze. She walked closer, her hand resting on Yi-jun's shoulder, her touch the only thing that could ground him. "If you kill him like this, you're still the anchor. You're still his monster. I need the man, Yi-jun, the man who taught me that I'm sacred." The silence that followed was deafening. Yi-jun stared at her, his jaw working as he wrestled with the darkness that had governed his life for 12 generations. Slowly, he lowered the gun. He looked at Park with a disgust that had no edge of violence. "Get out!" he ordered his men, who had finally secured the room. "Turn him over to the council. Let them see what a man with no honor looks like." As Park was dragged away, the sun began to rise over Seoul, casting a golden light through the shattered windows. Yi-jun turned to Ayanna, pulling her into his arms. He held her like he'd never let go, his forehead resting against hers as they both breathed through the aftermath of the siege. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her natural curls. "You're not that lucky," Ayanna joked, though her eyes were filled with tears. "I'm done, Ayanna," Yi-jun said, his voice fierce with determination. "I'm taking my life and the woman I love, and I'm walking away. The empire can burn. I have everything I need right here." They stood together in the morning light, a broken boss and a feisty waitress who had become a family forged not by blood, but by choice. The siege of Seoul was over, but as they looked out at the horizon, Ayanna realized their new life was just beginning. A life where they wouldn't be anchored to the past, but free to drift toward a future they had built with their own hands. 6 months had passed since the neon-soaked high-rises of Seoul had faded into the rearview mirror of a life Yi-jun Gok no longer recognized as his own. The Oregon coast was a world of muted grays and vibrant greens, where the only anchor in his life was the weight of Ayanna's hand in his as they walked along the rugged shoreline. Yi-jun had shed the custom-tailored charcoal suits for the simple comfort of a man who no longer had to dress for war. Beside him, Ayanna moved with a peace she had never known in the cramped apartments of Itaewon or the bustling floors of the Obsidian. The profound moral lesson of their journey was that true power lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the courage to walk away from a legacy of violence to protect what is sacred. For 12 generations, the Gok men had mistaken their anchor for a symbol of strength, when in reality it was a chain dragging them into the lightless depths of tradition and greed. Ayanna's defiance at the restaurant, that singular, feisty moment where she chose to pour a drink rather than swallow her pride, was the catalyst that proved respect is a currency earned through integrity, not terror. The story of the boss and the waitress serves as a timeless reminder that family is defined by choice, not by bloodlines or ancient laws. To the syndicate elders, Ayanna was a stain on a pure lineage. To Yi-jun, she was the only thing clean enough to show him the monster he had become and the man he could still be. When Yi-jun chose Ayanna over his empire, he demonstrated that vulnerability is not a weakness, but the highest form of bravery. Ultimately, the lesson is that we are never truly moored to a destiny we did not choose. Like Ayanna, one must have the spirit to challenge the status quo, even when the world demands silence. Like Yi-jun, one must have the strength to let the monster die so that love can finally take its first breath. Home, they finally understood, was never a territory to be defended or a legacy to be upheld. It was the person who looked into your soul and saw salvation instead of a title. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting a golden light that mirrored the first dawn of their new life, Yi-jun and Ayanna realized that their story wasn't just about surviving a mafia war. It was about the enduring truth that when you find someone who makes you want to be better, you've found the only empire worth keeping.